1963. I'm going to tell you about what brought them to this site, why they were here, and you're going to hear a message that they heard that weekend as well. So, the first successful piece of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s started in December in Montgomery, Alabama. You guys have heard of Rosa Parks, correct? Yeah. So, Miss Rosa Parks decided one night after work, after her job as a seamstress in Montgomery, that she was no longer going to be bullied from the Jim Crow laws of segregation that had been going on for years and years and decades in her town. Now, she was a black woman, and at that time, African American people, blacks, and other minorities were not allowed to use the public transit system in a way that we would use it today, after school or after work. So when she hopped on the bus and paid her fare, that was 10 cents, she had to move to the back half of the bus for white passengers to be able to use the front half. The bus was full that day after work. The bus was full that day after work, and a white passenger entered the bus from the front, and there were no more spaces for those passengers on the front half of the bus. Now, there was 4 spaces on the bus in the first row for colored people, and the other 3 were asked to move because that was normally how things worked at that time. I have to call the police, you're breaking the law. And she decided to stand up or sit down for herself that day and not move. And she went off to jail. Over the course of the next year, the minorities, African Americans and blacks of that neighborhood and Montgomery, that city, decided that they would boycott the use of the bus system. It started to bankrupt the buses. And then 1 year later at Christmas in 1956, the city officials had to make a big decision and change the laws of that community to say that anybody could use the bus anywhere, because when a group of people decided to use that system of boycotting, civil disobedience and protest against the white establishment at the time, it started to work and get attention. Well, Dr. Martin Luther King showed up in Montgomery to help with that organizational effort. So over the course of the next several years, Dr. King, his friends, and several people like you and like I decided to move all across the Southeast. In Atlanta, Georgia, where Dr. King was from. In Columbia, South Carolina. In North Carolina. In Louisiana, in Georgia, all over the place. But things are terrible back home. We want jobs and we want freedom. So we need you to talk to the men and women who make the laws of this country to change things all over the South. And President Kennedy thought about it. He said, you've got some good points. We've got to do something. And then Dr. King approached all of the folks who came to this spot. Right here, there's a marker. Right where several of our folks are standing. At the end of that weekend, he came to the podium late because the meeting with the president went long. And he looked out over this expanse, and this is what he told the people. According to the paper and program they had that weekend, his speech was called Remarks. And this is what he said. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, The Negro is languished to the corners of American society, and he finds himself in exile in his own land. So we have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check which will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. And for those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content, will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of this nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hate. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must never allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We cannot be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro in Mississippi cannot vote And a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, no, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that many of you have come here today out of great trials and tribulations. Many of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Many of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veteran of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to Georgia. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, and so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brothers. I have a dream that one day, even in the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will one day be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain will be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope, and this is the faith that I go back to the South. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. And this will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside let freedom ring, and if America's to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing together in the words of the old Negro spirit. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.